All right, welcome again, ladies and gentlemen, to this edition of Sandy Hook Hoaxers Debunked, brought to you by NewtownPostExaminer.com and SandyHookStalkers.wordpress.com. I'm your host, Keith Johnson, and today we visit the YouTube channel of a hoaxer who goes by the name Scott Anthony, who also has a very modest little blog he calls Flash News Network. Now, this is a guy I have never heard of until just recently, but who is now permanently on my radar for reasons I'll discuss near the conclusion of this episode. And Scott is just basically another one of these, what I like to call phantoms, a faceless, voiceless drone with no known credentials, almost certainly going by a fake name. As most of you know, these people are a dime a dozen on the internet and usually fall under this category. They're not experts, they're not investigators, they just simply have internet access. Now, today we will be discussing one of Scott's recent videos entitled Sandy Hook Deception, Exposing Sibley Lies, which has become a topic of discussion over on the Sandy Hook Hoax Facebook page, and that's why we're covering it. Now, for those unfamiliar, Sibley, or more specifically Barbara Sibley, is one of two Sandy Hook moms who met at the front of the elementary school on December 14th and saw the shattered glass before hearing gunshots and taking cover behind a rubbish skip, or what's commonly referred to as a trash dumpster. Now, these two ladies are discussed in the final report. If you care to follow up, you'll find them mentioned in Book 5, Documents 3341 and 9062. I'll just give a little plug for the Newtown Post-Examiner, because if you go to that website and find the Official Reports tab, you can click on that and go directly to Book 5 and find those docs. But no need to do that now, because Scott doesn't refer to the final report in his video. Instead, he chops up selected bits and pieces from two media interviews Mr. and Mrs. Sibley gave. The first one being this here with Katie Couric. That's from 2012, December 17th, 2012 to be precise. And Scott also takes bits and pieces from this, The World Surviving Sandy Hook, a BBC documentary that was published in March of this year, 2015. Now, this is our boy Scott, or at least this is how I see him, a comic book character, because we never, ever see this guy's face or hear his voice. He hides behind a veil of anonymity and shouts his accusations at this traumatized couple in text, in bold text. That's about as bold as this guy will get, is by yelling at people in bold text. And as you'll see, he's playing the part of an attorney and relentlessly badgers the witnesses with accusations and questions that I will be addressing on their behalf. And what Scott is trying, but ultimately fails to prove, is that the Sibleys gave two distinctly different versions of what happened that day. In other words, what they discuss in this most recent BBC interview contradicts the account that was given in the earlier Couric interview. Got it? Okay, so let's go to the first interview back in December 2012, and here's where Katie Couric asked Barbara Sibley what she saw when she arrived at the school.
There were like 8 or 10 kids who were, running basically towards the firehouse, and I, obviously thought that was odd. But when I got out of the car and started walking towards the building, I noticed a car, in the drop-off area in front of the entrance, like a black hatchback, had all the doors open and like black sweatshirts strewn around it. And again, I thought, well, that's really odd.
Okay, now the car she's referring to is the black Honda driven by shooter Adam Lanza. And although Scott doesn't touch on this, I will, because there's been some confusion in the past about this statement. As you can see, Mrs. Sibley distinctly says that she recalls the vehicle being like a black hatchback that had all the doors open. It was like a black hatchback, meaning that this was a vague recollection or her best guess from a casual glance. And this is even more important. All the doors open. Okay? Not all 4 doors like this video has in quotes. If she had said all 4 doors, that would be a specific recollection. Like, I remember it was a Ford F-150. That's a very specific recollection. But no, Mrs. Sibley specifically said, quote, all the doors, unquote, were open, which is not accurate. The vehicle that Lanza was driving was a 4-door sedan. It was not a hatchback. But look at this vehicle, folks. You can see where someone might mistakenly identify it as a hatchback. And if, in her mind, this was a 2-door hatchback, then yes, 2 open doors would be, quote, unquote, all the doors. And remember, folks, Mrs. Sibley was not on high alert when she entered that parking lot. It's not as though someone warned her that she was entering an active crime scene and instructed her to commit to memory everything she observed. Okay, so I think we've exhausted this point enough, so let's move on.
I walked to the doorway, and there was another mom standing there, and all the while I'm thinking to myself, the building is so quiet, and why is it so quiet?
Okay, so at this point, our internet lawyer Scott interjects and says, yes, Mrs. Sibley, good point. Why so quiet? You see, he's trying to hammer home the point that this alone was Barbara's version of what transpired at the school when she spoke with Katie Couric. That it was quiet. And I must interject here, folks, that I have done a lot of debunking, and I must say that not since Bridget Norris and the Flex Fit hat hoax, which I exposed personally, have I ever stumbled upon a bigger liar than Scott Anthony. I mean, this is outright disinformation and deliberate deception on his part. I mean, at least the others, in my opinion, the people I've debunked in the past, at least they believed in the stuff they were putting out. But Scott has deliberately altered the material to reach a false conclusion. And this is deplorable and inexcusable. Now, let's continue with the Couric interview up to the point where he, Scott, decides to end it.
I said to her, is something going on? And she goes, I don't know, but look. And she pointed, and I looked, and next to the door where there's a buzzer, you have to buzz into the building, the whole plate glass window to the right of the door was shattered, and there was glass everywhere. And we looked at that, and we said, well, this is really strange.
Once again, our internet lawyer interjects, saying, strange. Here is something even more strange, Miss Sibley. Look at the shirt Mr. Sibley is wearing. And why does your story change for the BBC interview? Is it a coincidence that he is wearing the same shirt? Is it a coincidence your version of what happened that morning changed? All right, let's take the first question Scott raises about the shirt. I'm not sure what point he's trying to make exactly, but he points out that Mr. Sibley is wearing a red plaid shirt in both interviews. Here he is in the Couric interview, and I want you to take particular note as to what Barbara looks like here and what she's wearing. Now, here's a side-by-side I put together. On the left is the Couric interview, and BBC is on the right. Yes, he's wearing the same shirt, but notice how different they look. He and Barbara have different hair color. Barbara's hairdo is completely different. His hair is noticeably longer, gray. Her clothing is different. If he's trying to suggest, I'm talking about Scott here, if he's trying to suggest that these interviews are conducted or were conducted on the same day, then he has failed to convince me, and I'm sure he's failed to convince others. Minor point, so let's move on. On to Scott Anthony's Exhibit B, the most recent BBC interview.
So then I walked from my car to the front entrance of the building. And then at that moment, I heard the firing of a gun and the shots being fired. And it was deafening. It was overwhelming. It was right there. I mean, it was so close. And it was like there was no thinking involved. It was just run. Just fast.
So, which version is the truth, Mrs. Sibley? Quiet or mayhem? You see, he's got you thinking. This is all that we can glean from the Couric interview. That, quote, the building is quiet, and, quote, why is it so quiet? Whereas the BBC interview contradicts her testimony because she mentions hearing the gun and shots being fired. Well, folks, you're about to find out where the true deception lies, and that's with Scott Anthony. Because what he has done is deliberately omit portions of the Katie Couric interview that specifically discusses gunshots and what Mrs. Sibley did upon hearing them. Now remember, this is how far Scott goes in his video.
And we looked at that and we said, well, this is really strange.
This is really strange. That's where Scott cuts the interview. That's all he wants to share. But as you can see, there's a lot more.
And we looked at that and we said, well, this is really strange. And as soon as those words kind of came out of our mouth, we started hearing gunshots. I knew that it was gunfire, but, I just ran. I just ran.
Yes, Scott, it looks as though your case is starting to fall apart. Turns out she mentions the gunshots in both interviews after all. And that her reaction to that was to, well, her precise words in the Couric interview was, I just ran, I just ran. Is that different from the BBC interview? Let's listen in.
I heard the firing of a gun and the shots being fired, and it was deafening. It was like there was no thinking involved. It was just run.
Okay, now what I've done here is isolate statements from both interviews. BBC is in yellow, Couric in blue, lined up pretty much about the same time when all these things transpired. Now you notice in the BBC interview, she just simply says, "So I walked from my car to the front entrance of the building." Whereas in the Couric interview, she goes into greater details. After she gets out of the car, she walked to the doorway, and then there was another mom standing there, and all the while I'm thinking to myself, the building is so quiet. And why is it so quiet? So basically, in the BBC interview, she is giving an abridged, shorter version, the meat and potatoes. And believe it or not, folks, there's no law against that. Now take note in the Couric interview, Mrs. Sibley says, quote, "All the while I'm thinking to myself," unquote. So as she is walking to the front entrance, it was during that time that she was thinking that the building was quiet. But that quiet would soon be interrupted. It says here in the BBC interview, and then at that moment, meaning when she reached the front entrance of the school, "I heard the firing of a gun and the shots being fired. It was deafening. It was overwhelming. I was right there. I mean, blah, blah, blah." And there was no thinking involved. It was just run as fast as you can away. Then we have Couric, where Sibley includes what she discussed with the other mom. So she goes into greater detail here. Now take note as I read this, how long it takes me to get through it. "And I said to her, 'Is there something going on?' And she goes, 'I don't know, but look.' And she pointed, and I looked, and next to the door where there's a buzzer, you have to buzz into the building. The whole plate glass window is to the right of the door was shattered, and there was glass everywhere. And we looked at that, and we said, well, this is really strange.' And as soon as those words kind of came out of our mouth, we started hearing gunshots. I knew that it was gunfire, but, I didn't. I just ran, I ran." Now, folks, describing all of that takes a lot of time and leaves one with the impression that maybe 30 seconds elapsed before shots were heard. But describing it and experiencing it are two different things. In reality, this is how long it takes after she arrives at the front entrance. "Is there something going on?" And she goes, "I don't know, but look." "Well, this is strange." Boom, gunfire. That's how long it really took. Notice she says in the Couric interview, quote, "As soon as those words came out of our mouth, we started hearing gunshots." So it was almost instantaneous. Okay? Compare that to the BBC interview where she says, "At that moment," in other words, when she reached the front of the building, "I heard the firing of a gun and the shots being fired." And what is a moment? It's a pretty subjective word. It's a brief period of time. It could be a split second, a second, or even a minute. So in that moment, meaning that brief period of time when she was at the front of the building conversing with the other mom, is when she heard the shots fired, and soon after they ran. As you can see, no contradictions whatsoever. Sibley simply went into greater detail in the Couric interview, and as I have stated, there is no law against that. So, as you can see, when the full evidence is proffered for your consideration, our dishonest and thoroughly discredited internet lawyer's case falls apart at the seams. Of course, this is his main argument, and we could stop there, but why not push forward and address his other minor points? For instance, in the Couric interview, Mr. Sibley states that for a time they were completely in the dark and didn't know if the shooter was alive or had been killed shot by police or dead by some other means. Now, the first thing that comes to my mind when they say by some other means is suicide. But that's not how Scott sees it. Dead by some other means? Do you mean assassinated? A nuclear explosion? What do you mean by some other means? You see what I mean, folks? Then there's this statement Mr. Sibley makes where he basically says that once the smoke started to clear and more information started to come out, that it became clear that they needed to take it to the next level, which makes perfect sense to me. You drive cautiously until there's a break in the fog, and then you can speed things up a little. Of course, that's not how Scott sees it. New level, like something went wrong with the original plan. So you see, folks, I'm not going to entertain that kind of paranoid and delusional mindset. As I've stated before, I'm not in the business of fixing the broken minds of conspiracy theorists. I make these videos for the reasonable and prudent, and I don't think it's necessary to point out just how ridiculous Scott's statements are to reasonable and prudent people. Okay, so one last point Scott raised in his video, and this concerns statements Mr. Sibley makes in 2 separate interviews in this BBC documentary. And this requires very little effort on my part. All I ask is that you follow along with the continuity of events being described by Mr. Sibley, something that Scott apparently has a hard time grasping.
The phone was ringing at that point, and it was Barb, and she said, Rob, I'm here. And I said, I'm going to a scene, you know, that sort of thing. And the best I can remember the conversation was, she says, I know, I'm at the school. And she says, I'm hiding. And I thought, you're hiding under a desk? And so my words to you were, you know, stay low, and I'll be there soon. And you said something to the effect of, make sure the twins are okay. To the effect of, like, I won't be coming out of this.
Okay, so imagine now you just got off the phone with your wife. You're on the way there, and she's on the phone with the cops. But she has left you with this terrifying worst-case scenario in your mind. You think she's inside the school, crouched under a desk with a deranged killer on the loose, and she's planted this idea in your mind that she won't make it out of there alive. So, now you finally arrive at the school.
When I arrived, thinking that my wife was no longer with us, you know, I saw her escorted by the police across the parking lot. So I was the first person who kind of had that relief, knowing that a family member was okay.
Okay, that sounds pretty cut and dry, folks, right? So what's the problem? Do you see any contradictions in those interviews? Well, I'm not confused in the slightest, but our internet attorney Scott Anthony here has thrown up some red flags. Wait, didn't you say you just talked to Barb on the way to Sandy Hook? Then Scott turns to the jury and he says, did you hear the 2 distinctly different versions? No, and this is Keith Johnson, the goofy-looking juror speaking. No, I did not. What I heard is 2 distinctly different accounts about 2 distinctly different periods of time. One when Mr. Sibley was on the phone with his wife, and then later after he arrived at the school. I mean, why belabor the issue any longer? I rest my case. Is it even necessary for me to prove that he's talking about 2 different things? I think not. Now, as for our disgraced internet lawyer, you may be saying, Keith, you're being awfully rough on this guy, aren't you? Well, folks, no, I am not. This is personal. This guy, whom I have never met before in my life, has been making false accusations about me. And before we get into that, let me just point out something that was brought to my attention, that this Scott Anthony has already got a pretty bad reputation on the internet amongst quite a few people, and is known for making up stories. I mean, get a load of this. This is just a recent example where the subject of lawsuits was brought up, and apparently he was mentioned as a possible defendant. And this is what he had to say about that. I have a team of attorneys that work for me that have all the time in the world to spend on this. And guess what? They are salaried. So there's no out-of-pocket costs for me. I mean, have you ever heard of such BS in your entire life? I mean, you could read the rest for yourself. It gets even more ridiculous. I mean, folks, do I really need to point out the absurdity of that claim? I mean, here we have a guy who won't show his face or share his credentials, who puts together poorly made YouTube videos that get a few hundred hits if he's lucky. He doesn't even have a website. I mean, it's hosted by Google Blogspot. I mean, you check that out if you want to be nonplussed. And we're supposed to believe that he's got a team of attorneys that, quote, have all the time in the world. Yeah, right. Now, Scott, if that's true, why don't you prove it by lending one of those lawyers out to Wolfgang Halbig, a person whom you admire, because I heard he's in desperate need of an attorney. He spent all his money and he needs one, so yeah, that ain't happening. But you know, ladies and gentlemen, it's not just that this guy is a liar. There's plenty of liars out there on the internet. What makes this guy special and why he is now on my radar is because he has lied about me. and not just lied, but accused me of committing a crime. And this kind of libel I do not take lightly. I don't think anybody does. And here's where the libel was printed in this article he wrote for Before It's News, titled Threats Made to Sandy Hook Researchers, that got several thousand views. And in that article, he specifically states, quote, Keith Johnson issues threats of violence against Sandy Hook researchers. And as proof of this allegation, he links to a doctored version of a video I posted several weeks ago. The video he posts is titled Master Troll, I guess that being me, discusses masturbation, Sandy Hook style. Now, neither in that edited video nor in my original video do I even remotely issue threats of violence, folks. As a matter of fact, I make no threats whatsoever. I can't even reference something in that video that needs clarification. It's just not there. He made it up because he was insulted at the way I refer to hoaxers as pests, and this was his way of getting revenge. He purposely wanted to paint me in a bad light, portray me as a violent person, and accused me of a crime I did not commit in order to inspire hatred against me. This is inexcusable. So I confronted Scott Anthony about this, very diplomatically, mind you, simply asked if he wrote the article, and I have heard absolutely nothing from him. But guess what? The article has now disappeared. And that doctored video, that's also gone. But the evidence still remains. Just simply Google Keith Johnson issues threats, and you'll find this cached in a search. So you've not heard the end of this, Scott Anthony. I notice on your Google Plus page that you have this as a motto. Well, you may soon learn that those are foolish words to live by, because I do intend on taking legal action on this. So all of you should stay tuned for that. In the meantime, folks, that'll wrap up this edition of Sandy Hook Hoaxers Debunked. I've been away on family business over the past few weeks, but I hope to get back to the business of making more videos. So check out these websites and subscribe to this channel, because there's a lot more where this came from. So until next time, this is Keith Johnson signing off.